The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete expanse of Fort Braxton Military Base as Lieutenant Marcus Rodriguez adjusted his uniform and took his position at the main security checkpoint. It was going to be another routine Tuesday, or so he thought. The base was preparing for the annual inspection by high-ranking officials from the Pentagon, and everyone was on edge, ensuring every protocol was followed to the letter. At precisely 800 hours, a modest sedan approached the checkpoint. Unlike the typical military vehicles or official black SUVs that usually carried important personnel, this car looked ordinary, a silver Toyota Camry that could belong to anyone. Rodriguez squinted against the morning glare as the vehicle slowed to a stop. The driver's side door opened, and out stepped a woman who appeared to be in her early 50s. She was of average height, with graying brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore civilian clothes, dark slacks, a white blouse, and comfortable walking shoes. Nothing about her appearance suggested military authority or government significance. She carried only a small leather purse and what appeared to be a folder of documents. "Good morning," she said pleasantly, approaching the checkpoint with a confident stride. "I need to access the base." Rodriguez exchanged a glance with his partner, Sergeant Thompson, who was reviewing the day's authorized visitor list on his tablet. The woman didn't look like any of the expected VIPs they had been briefed about. Those officials were supposed to arrive in official convoys with advanced security details. "Ma'am, I'll need to see some identification and verify your appointment," Rodriguez said, maintaining his professional demeanor while internally noting how out of place she seemed. The woman reached into her purse and produced what appeared to be a military identification card, though she held it in such a way that Rodriguez couldn't immediately see the details. "I don't have a scheduled appointment," she said matter-of-factly, "but I need to speak with Colonel Harrison immediately." Thompson looked up from his tablet, frowning slightly. "Ma'am, Colonel Harrison is in meetings all morning preparing for the Pentagon inspection. He's not available for unscheduled visits. If you'd like to make an appointment, I understand he's busy," the woman interrupted gently but firmly. "However, this matter concerns the inspection directly." "I really do need to see him now." Rodriguez studied her more carefully. Despite her civilian appearance and calm demeanor, there was something in her posture. The way she stood with her shoulders back, her direct eye contact, and the authoritative tone beneath her polite words. That suggested she wasn't just another civilian with a complaint or request. "Ma'am, you can't go in without proper authorization," Rodriguez said, following protocol. "The base is under heightened security due to the upcoming inspection. If you could please provide me with the nature of your business and any documentation that supports your need to access the base." The woman smiled, but Rodriguez noticed it didn't quite reach her eyes. "The nature of my business is military operations, soldier, and I assure you, I have every right to be here." "I understand that, ma'am, but I still need to verify—" "What's your name and rank?" she asked suddenly, her tone shifting slightly. "Lieutenant Marcus Rodriguez, ma'am," he responded automatically, something in her commanding presence making him answer before he could think about why she was asking. "Lieutenant Rodriguez," she said, and now her voice carried an unmistakable note of authority that made both soldiers unconsciously straighten their postures. "How long have you been stationed at Fort Braxton?" 18 months, ma'am," Rodriguez replied, increasingly puzzled by the direction of the conversation. "And in those 18 months, have you ever had occasion to question orders from your superiors?" "No, ma'am, of course not," he said quickly. "Good. Then perhaps you could explain to me why you feel qualified to prevent me from entering this base." The question hung in the air like a challenge. Rodriguez felt a growing sense of unease, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly why. The woman's civilian clothes suggested she had no authority here, yet everything about her manner indicated otherwise. It was like looking at a puzzle where the pieces didn't quite fit together. "Ma'am, With all due respect, I'm following standard security protocols. Unless you have proper authorization or are on the approved visitor list, I cannot allow you access to the base." "I see," she said, pulling out her cell phone. "Sergeant Thompson, is it?" Thompson nodded, looking increasingly uncomfortable. "Sergeant Thompson, would you please call Colonel Harrison's office and inform him that I'm here to see him?" "Ma'am, I already told you he's not available for unscheduled meetings," Thompson began. "Just make the call, Sergeant," she said, and there was something in her tone that made both men feel like they were walking through a minefield without a map. Thompson reluctantly picked up the base phone and dialed the colonel's office. After a brief conversation, he hung up with a frustrated expression. "His aide says the colonel is in back-to-back meetings until this afternoon and cannot be disturbed," Thompson reported. The woman nodded as if she had expected this response. "And did you mention my name?" "Ma'am, you haven't actually told us your name," Rodriguez pointed out. For the first time, the woman seemed genuinely surprised. She looked at them both with an expression that suggested she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "I haven't told you my name?" she repeated slowly. "No, ma'am, you haven't," Rodriguez confirmed. She shook her head with what might have been amusement or disbelief. "Gentlemen, this is quite remarkable. In all my years of service, I don't think I've ever encountered a situation quite like this." "Your years of service?" Thompson asked. "Tell me," she continued, ignoring his question. "What do you know about the inspection team that's arriving today?" Rodriguez and Thompson exchanged glances. This wasn't information they were supposed to discuss with civilians, but her confident questioning made them feel like they were the ones being tested. "Ma'am, we can't discuss operational details with unauthorized personnel," Rodriguez said carefully. "Unauthorized personnel," she repeated, and now there was definitely amusement in her voice. "Lieutenant Rodriguez, I want you to think very carefully about your next actions. This situation is developing in a way that could have significant consequences for your career." "Are you threatening us, ma'am?" Thompson asked, his hand instinctively moving closer to his radio. "Threatening? Not at all, Sergeant. I'm simply observing that sometimes in the military, small decisions can have large ramifications. The decision to follow protocol is usually the right one, but occasionally the bigger picture requires a different approach." Rodriguez felt sweat beginning to form on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Something was very wrong with this situation, but he couldn't put his finger on what it was. The woman seemed too comfortable, too confident for someone being denied access to a military installation. It was as if she knew something they didn't. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back to your vehicle while we figure this out," Rodriguez said, trying to regain control of the situation. "I'm afraid that's not going to happen, Lieutenant," she said calmly. "Ma'am, if you don't comply, I'll have to call for backup," Thompson warned. "By all means, Sergeant, please do. I think it's time more people became involved in this situation." Thompson reached for his radio, but before he could activate it, another vehicle approached the checkpoint. This one was a black military SUV with official plates. Colonel Harrison himself was in the passenger seat, along with his aide and what appeared to be other high-ranking officers. The SUV pulled up behind the sedan, and Colonel Harrison stepped out, looking harried and slightly annoyed at having his schedule interrupted. "What's the holdup here?" he called out as he approached. "We have a tight schedule today, and I got a call that there was some kind of situation at the checkpoint." Rodriguez turned to face his commanding officer, relief flooding through him. Finally, someone with the authority to resolve this strange standoff. "Sir, this woman is requesting access to the base to meet with you, but she doesn't have authorization and isn't on any visitor list. She's been persistent about her need to enter." Colonel Harrison looked past Rodriguez to the woman, who had remained calm and composed throughout the entire exchange. For a moment, his expression was neutral, professional. Then, as recognition dawned, the color drained from his face. "Oh, my God," he whispered, barely audible. "Colonel?" Rodriguez asked, confused by his commanding officer's sudden change in demeanor. Harrison quickly walked past both guards toward the woman, his entire body language shifting from annoyance to something approaching panic. "I am so sorry," he began, but the woman raised a hand to stop him. "Colonel Harrison," she said with the same calm authority she had maintained throughout the confrontation, "we need to talk now." "Of course, absolutely," Harrison said quickly. "Please come with me immediately." As they began walking toward the base, Rodriguez called out, "Sir, what about the security protocols?" Harrison turned back, his face pale and his expression grave. "Lieutenant Rodriguez, Sergeant Thompson, you will say nothing about this incident to anyone until further notice. That's a direct order." "But sir," Thompson began, "who is she?" Harrison looked at the woman, who nodded slightly, apparently giving him permission to explain. "Gentlemen," Harrison said, his voice carrying a weight that made both guards understand they were about to learn something that would change their understanding of the morning's events entirely. "You have just spent the last 20 minutes preventing the Inspector General of the United States Army from entering her own inspection." The words hit Rodriguez like a physical blow. The Inspector General, the highest-ranking official responsible for investigating military operations, the person who could end careers with a single report, the officer who answered directly to the Army's top leadership. And they had just told her she couldn't enter the base. As the full implications of what had just happened began to sink in, Rodriguez watched the woman, the Inspector General, walk calmly toward the base's administrative buildings, her modest appearance now seeming like the perfect disguise for someone whose job it was to observe military operations without being recognized. The morning sun continued to shine brightly over Fort Braxton, but for Rodriguez and Thompson, the day had suddenly become much more complicated than either of them had ever imagined possible. The conference room on the third floor of Fort Braxton's administrative building had never felt smaller to Colonel Harrison. Across the polished oak table sat General Patricia Kellerman, Inspector General of the United States Army, the same woman who had been turned away at his front gate just 2 hours earlier. She had shed her civilian clothes for her dress uniform, and the stars on her shoulders seemed to catch and reflect every beam of light in the room. Harrison had seen General Kellerman's photograph in official military publications, but something about her civilian appearance that morning had thrown him off completely. Perhaps it was the stress of preparing for what he thought would be a routine inspection, or maybe it was the simple fact that inspector generals typically arrived with fanfare, advance teams, and official protocol. Never had one shown up alone in a civilian vehicle, looking like someone's aunt coming for a family visit. "Colonel," General Kellerman began, her voice steady and professional, "I want you to understand that what happened at your front gate this morning was not an accident. It was a test, one that your base failed quite spectacularly." Harrison swallowed hard. "Ma'am, if you could help me understand—" "The test was simple," she continued, consulting a file she had placed on the table. "Can the security personnel at Fort Braxton recognize authority when it doesn't come packaged in the expected format? Can they think beyond rigid protocol when the situation demands flexibility? And most importantly, are they trained to verify credentials properly rather than making assumptions based on appearances?" She opened the file, revealing photographs of the morning's incident. Harrison realized with growing alarm that the entire confrontation had been recorded by security cameras he hadn't even considered. "Your guards, Lieutenant Rodriguez and Sergeant Thompson, made several critical errors," General Kellerman explained. "First, they never actually examined my military identification card closely. When I produced it, they looked at it briefly but never processed the information it contained. Second, they never ran my name through the military personnel database, which would have immediately flagged my position and clearance level." Harrison felt his stomach drop. "Ma'am, they followed standard protocol for civilian visitors, but I wasn't a civilian visitor, Colonel. I was in civilian clothes, yes, but I identified myself as military personnel within the first minute of our interaction. At that point, protocol required them to verify my credentials through proper military channels, not treat me like a citizen requesting a base tour. General Kellerman stood and walked to the window overlooking the main courtyard where soldiers were conducting their daily training exercises. Tell me, Colonel, what do you know about the security briefings your guards receive regarding potential threats and unusual situations? Sir, ma'am, they receive monthly briefings on threat assessment, emergency protocols, and identification verification, Harrison replied, trying to keep his voice steady. And when was the last time those briefings included scenarios involving unannounced visits from high-ranking officials? Harrison realized he didn't know the answer. I would have to check with my security chief, ma'am. I already have, she said, turning back to face him. The answer is never. Your security training focuses exclusively on external threats, terrorists, spies, unauthorized civilian intrusion. But what about internal threats? What about officers who might try to exploit gaps in your security? What about testing whether your people can recognize legitimate authority even when it appears in unexpected forms? She returned to her seat and opened another section of her file. This morning's incident revealed a pattern of problems that goes far beyond two guards making a mistake. It exposed fundamental weaknesses in your base's security culture. Harrison felt sweat beginning to form on his forehead. What do you mean, ma'am? After I finally gained access to the base, I conducted several more tests, she explained. I visited the motor pool, the commissary, the training facilities, and the communications center. In each location, I presented myself as a visiting inspector general and asked to see various operational procedures. And, Harrison asked, though he dreaded the answer, in every single location, personnel either immediately believed my claim without verification, or they sent me to someone else without confirming my credentials. Not one person asked to see my identification again. Not one person called to verify my authority. They either turned me away based on assumptions, or they accepted my claimed authority without question. The implications hit Harrison like a series of hammer blows. If an actual enemy agent or imposter had managed to get onto the base, they could have potentially accessed sensitive information simply by claiming to be an inspector general. The most troubling incident, General Kellerman continued, occurred in your communications center. I told Staff Sergeant Williams that I needed to review your emergency communication protocols as part of my inspection. He not only showed me the procedures manual, but he actually demonstrated how to access the base-wide emergency broadcast system. Harrison closed his eyes briefly. The emergency broadcast system could be used to create chaos, spread misinformation, or coordinate attacks if it fell into the wrong hands. Ma'am, Harrison said carefully, are you saying that our security protocols are fundamentally flawed? I'm saying, Colonel, that your security protocols work well for the threats you've prepared for, but they fail completely when facing unexpected challenges. Your people have been trained to recognize threat patterns, but not to think critically about unusual situations that fall outside those patterns. General Kellerman pulled out a thick folder and placed it on the table. This is why I'm here, Colonel. Fort Braxton isn't the only installation with these problems. Over the past 6 months, my office has conducted similar unannounced tests at 11 military bases across the country. All 11 failed in similar ways. Harrison stared at the folder, understanding that it contained the results of a much larger investigation than he had initially realized. The pattern is consistent, she continued. Security personnel are either too rigid in their application of protocol, turning away legitimate authority figures, or too flexible, accepting claimed authority without proper verification. Neither approach protects military assets effectively. What does this mean for Fort Braxton? Harrison asked. That depends largely on how you and your staff respond to this wake-up call, General Kellerman replied. This isn't just about punishment, Colonel. It's about fixing a systemic problem that could have serious national security implications if left unaddressed. She stood again and began pacing slowly around the room. Let me tell you what I observed after my identity was revealed this morning. Lieutenant Rodriguez and Sergeant Thompson were both visibly shaken by their mistake. That's understandable. But what concerned me was their immediate assumption that they were going to face severe disciplinary action. "Aren't they?" Harrison asked, surprised. "That's exactly the wrong question, Colonel. The question should be, what can we learn from their mistake? And how can we prevent similar incidents in the future? If your first instinct is to punish people for failing a test they didn't know they were taking, then you're missing the point entirely." General Kellerman returned to her seat and pulled out a recording device. "I interviewed both guards after the incident. Would you like to hear what they told me?" Harrison nodded, dreading what he might hear. She pressed play, and Rodriguez's voice filled the room. "Ma'am, I keep thinking about how confident she was, like she belonged there, but she didn't look military, you know? She looked like my mom when she comes to visit. I think maybe I was looking for the wrong things." Thompson's voice followed. "The thing is, ma'am, we get so focused on stopping people who don't belong that maybe we forget how to recognize people who do belong, but just don't look like what we expect." General Kellerman stopped the recording. "These young men learned more about security in 2 hours this morning than they had in months of standard training. They're thinking critically about assumptions, appearance versus reality, and the complexity of real-world security challenges." "So what happens now?" Harrison asked. "Now we turn this incident into a learning opportunity for your entire base," she replied. "I'm going to spend the next 3 days here conducting a comprehensive review of your security procedures, training protocols, and personnel development programs. But more importantly, I'm going to work with you to develop new training scenarios that will prepare your people for unusual situations like the one that occurred this morning." She pulled out yet another document from her seemingly endless file. "This is a preliminary report on the current state of military base security across all branches. The Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines are all experiencing similar challenges. Traditional security training isn't keeping pace with the evolving nature of potential threats." Harrison scanned the document, noting statistical data about security failures, successful penetration tests, and incident reports from bases around the world. "The enemy isn't always going to attack us in the way we expect," General Kellerman explained. "Sometimes they'll come in uniform, sometimes in civilian clothes, sometimes they'll be foreigners, sometimes they'll be our own people who have been compromised, sometimes they'll try to break in, and sometimes they'll try to convince us to let them in." She leaned forward, her expression intense but not unkind. "What happened at your front gate this morning wasn't a failure of character or competence. It was a failure of imagination. Your guards couldn't imagine that an inspector general would arrive alone, in civilian clothes, in an ordinary car. They couldn't imagine that someone with legitimate authority might not look the part." "But how do we train people to imagine the unimaginable?" Harrison asked. "By exposing them to scenarios they've never considered before," she replied. "By teaching them to verify rather than assume. By showing them that security isn't just about following rules. It's about thinking critically about every situation." General Kellerman gathered her papers and stood to leave. "Colonel, I want you to gather your senior staff for a meeting this afternoon. We're going to design a new security training program, starting with the lessons learned from this morning's incident." As she reached the door, she turned back. "And Colonel, Rodriguez and Thompson will be participating in the development of this new training program. They've earned the right to help teach others how to avoid the same mistake they made." "Ma'am," Harrison said, standing as well, "may I ask why you chose to test us this way? Why not just conduct a traditional inspection?" General Kellerman smiled, the first genuine smile Harrison had seen from her all day. "Because traditional inspections only tell you how well people perform when they know they're being watched. Real security challenges happen when no one expects them. The only way to truly test security is to surprise the people responsible for maintaining it." She opened the door and stepped into the hallway, then paused. "Colonel, in my experience, the best military units aren't the ones that never fail. They're the ones that learn fastest from their failures and become stronger because of them. This morning, Fort Braxton failed a test. This afternoon, we begin the process of making sure that failure makes you stronger." As General Kellerman walked away, Harrison remained standing in the empty conference room, staring out the window at his base with entirely new eyes. The soldiers conducting their exercises below looked the same as they had that morning, but everything else had changed. The easy assumption that good security meant following established protocols had been shattered, replaced by the much more complex reality that effective security required constant adaptation and critical thinking. He reached for his phone to call his senior staff meeting, knowing that the next few days would transform not just Fort Braxton's security procedures, but potentially the entire base's understanding of what it meant to serve and protect in an unpredictable world. 6 months later, Lieutenant Marcus Rodriguez stood at the same security checkpoint where his military career had nearly ended on that memorable Tuesday morning. But everything was different now. The procedures, the training, the mindset, and most importantly, his own understanding of what real security meant. The new security protocols developed after General Kellerman's visit had transformed Fort Braxton into a model installation that was now being studied by military bases across all branches of service. Rodriguez had gone from being the guard who made a critical error to being one of the lead instructors in the revolutionary new training program that emerged from that mistake. "Remember," Rodriguez was telling a group of new security personnel during their orientation, "appearance can be deceiving, but credentials don't lie if you actually check them properly." He held up a military identification card, pointing to specific features. "Look here at the holographic seal, the embedded chip, and the biometric data. Most importantly, always run the ID through the verification system. Always." Sergeant Thompson, who had been promoted to training coordinator for the new security program, nodded approvingly from the back of the room. The incident that could have destroyed both their careers had instead launched them into positions of greater responsibility and respect. "Sir," one of the new recruits raised her hand, "what if someone refuses to let you examine their ID closely?" "Excellent question, Private Johnson," Rodriguez replied. "That's actually a red flag. Legitimate personnel want you to verify their credentials properly. If someone gets impatient or tries to rush you through the process, that should make you more careful, not less." He clicked to the next slide of his presentation, which showed a photograph of a modest sedan approaching a checkpoint. The recruits didn't know it, but they were looking at the exact moment when General Kellerman had arrived at Fort Braxton 6 months earlier. "This is from an actual incident that occurred here at Fort Braxton," Rodriguez continued. "A high-ranking military official arrived for an unannounced inspection in civilian clothes, driving a personal vehicle. The guards on duty that day made several mistakes that could have had serious consequences." Private Johnson raised her hand again. "What kind of mistakes, sir?" Rodriguez smiled slightly. He had learned to find the teaching moments in his own failure. They made assumptions based on appearance rather than verifying credentials. They followed rigid protocols without thinking critically about the unusual situation. And they failed to recognize that sometimes legitimate authority doesn't look like what you expect it to look like. After the class ended, Rodriguez walked through the base toward the administrative building where he had a meeting scheduled with Colonel Harrison. The base had changed dramatically since General Kellerman's visit. The rigid hierarchy that once discouraged questions and critical thinking had been replaced by a culture that valued adaptive problem-solving and continuous learning. In Colonel Harrison's office, Rodriguez found the commander reviewing reports from other military installations that had implemented similar training programs based on the Fort Braxton model. "Lieutenant," Harrison said, looking up from his paperwork, "I just received word from General Kellerman's office. She's planning another visit next month." Rodriguez felt his stomach tighten slightly, but not with the same panic that would have consumed him 6 months earlier. "Another test, sir?" "Most likely," Harrison replied. "But this time, we'll be ready for the unexpected." "Sir, may I ask you something?" Rodriguez said. "Of course. Do you think she knew we would fail that first test?" Harrison leaned back in his chair, considering the question. "I think General Kellerman has been conducting these tests long enough to know that most installations fail initially. The point wasn't to catch us succeeding. It was to identify where we were vulnerable and help us fix those vulnerabilities." "It's strange," Rodriguez mused. 6 months ago, I thought I understood what security meant. Follow the rules, check the lists, keep unauthorized people out. Now I realize that real security is much more complex." "How so?" Harrison asked, genuinely interested in his perspective. "Real security requires you to think about what you're actually trying to protect and who you're trying to protect it from," Rodriguez replied. "Sometimes the biggest threat isn't the person trying to break in. It's the person you assume belongs there who actually doesn't." Harrison nodded. "And sometimes the person you assume doesn't belong there actually has every right to be there." 3 weeks later, Rodriguez was once again on duty at the main checkpoint when a familiar black SUV approached. This time, however, he recognized it immediately as an official military vehicle. General Kellerman stepped out, wearing her dress uniform with all its insignia clearly visible. "Good morning, Lieutenant Rodriguez," she said as she approached the checkpoint. "Good morning, ma'am," he replied, standing at attention. "May I see your identification, please?" She smiled and produced her military ID. Rodriguez examined it carefully, checking all the security features they had drilled endlessly over the past months. He ran it through the verification system and confirmed her identity and clearance level. "Thank you, ma'am. You're cleared to enter the base. Would you like an escort to any particular destination?" "Actually, Lieutenant, I'd like to speak with you for a moment first," she said. Rodriguez felt his pulse quicken, but he maintained his composure. "Of course, ma'am." "I've been following the reports on the new training program you and Sergeant Thompson have been developing," she said. "The results have been impressive. Other bases are reporting significant improvements in security effectiveness after implementing your methods." "Thank you, ma'am. We learned a lot from our mistakes." "That's exactly why I wanted to talk to you," she said. "The Department of Defense is creating a new inter-service security training center. They need instructors who understand both the theoretical principles of adaptive security and the practical realities of implementing those principles in the field." Rodriguez stared at her, not quite comprehending what she was suggesting. "Lieutenant Rodriguez, how would you feel about a transfer to the Pentagon to help develop security training protocols for all military branches?" The offer was so unexpected that Rodriguez had to take a moment to process it. 6 months ago, he had thought his career was over. Now, the same general whose authority he had failed to recognize was offering him an opportunity that could define the rest of his military service. "Ma'am, I would be honored," he managed to say. "The position would come with a promotion to captain," she added, "and Sergeant Thompson would be offered a similar position, also with a promotion." "Ma'am, may I ask why you're offering this to us?" General Kellerman smiled the same genuine smile that Colonel Harrison had seen during her first visit. "Captain Rodriguez, and yes, you might as well get used to that title. The military's greatest asset isn't its weapons or its technology. It's its ability to learn from mistakes and become stronger because of them. You and Thompson represent that principle perfectly." "But we're the ones who made the mistake in the first place," Rodriguez pointed out. "Exactly," she replied. "That's what makes you qualified to teach others how to avoid similar mistakes. You understand the psychology of security failure because you've lived it. You know how easy it is to make assumptions and how dangerous those assumptions can be." She pulled out a folder and handed it to him. "These are the preliminary plans for the new training center. Take a look and let me know if you're interested." Rodriguez opened the folder and found himself looking at blueprints and organizational charts for a facility that would revolutionize military security training across all branches of service. The program would focus on adaptive thinking, critical analysis, and scenario-based learning rather than rote memorization of procedures. "Ma'am," he said, looking up from the documents, "this is incredible. When would this begin?" "Construction starts next month. The first classes would begin in 8 months. That gives us time to develop the curriculum and train the initial cadre of instructors." "Us?" Rodriguez asked. "Captain Rodriguez, if you accept this position, you'll be helping to design the training that will prepare the next generation of military security personnel. You'll be taking the lessons learned from that Tuesday morning 6 months ago and using them to make the entire military more secure." Rodriguez thought about the journey he had traveled since that confusing morning when he had turned away the Inspector General of the Army. The embarrassment and fear had gradually transformed into understanding and purpose. The mistake that could have ended his career had instead opened doors he never could have imagined. "Ma'am, I accept," he said without hesitation. "Excellent," she replied. "I'll have the paperwork processed this week." As General Kellerman prepared to leave, she turned back one more time. "Captain, there's one more thing I want you to know. That Tuesday morning 6 months ago, you and Thompson weren't the first guards to turn me away from a military installation, but you were the first ones who seemed to genuinely question whether they were making the right decision. That hesitation, that moment of doubt you both showed, that's what told me you had the capacity to learn and grow from the experience." "Ma'am," Rodriguez said, confused. "Most guards who turn away legitimate authority do so with complete confidence that they're following proper procedures. They never question their assumptions. But I could see in both your faces that you sensed something wasn't quite right, even if you couldn't put your finger on what it was." She smiled one final time. That ability to sense when a situation doesn't fit normal patterns. That's exactly the kind of critical thinking we need to teach to every person responsible for military security. As General Kellerman's SUV disappeared through the checkpoint, Rodriguez stood in the morning sunshine, reflecting on the extraordinary path that had led him to this moment. In a few months, he would be training military personnel from all branches of service, sharing the hard-learned lessons of that memorable Tuesday morning when everything changed. Sergeant Thompson approached the checkpoint, having just finished his own training session with a new group of recruits. "How did it go with the general?" Thompson asked. "Tom," Rodriguez said, using his partner's first name as their friendship had grown over the months of working together to develop the new training programs. "How do you feel about moving to Washington, D.C.? "What?" Thompson asked, startled. Rodriguez handed him a copy of the folder General Kellerman had given him. "We're going to be teaching the whole military how to avoid making the same mistake we made." Thompson opened the folder and read through the documents, his expression shifting from confusion to amazement to excitement. "Marcus," he said finally, 6 months ago we thought we had ended our careers by questioning the wrong person. And now we're going to spend our careers teaching others to question everything," Rodriguez replied. They stood together at the checkpoint that had been the site of their greatest professional failure and their most important learning experience. Around them, Fort Braxton continued its daily operations, but with a new culture of adaptive thinking and continuous improvement that had emerged from a single morning's confusion. The modest sedan that had started it all was long gone, but its impact would be felt throughout the military for years to come. Sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected teachers, and sometimes the greatest opportunities arise from the moments when everything seems to go wrong. As Rodriguez and Thompson prepared for the next phase of their careers, they both understood that they would carry with them forever the memory of the morning. They learned that true authority doesn't always announce itself with fanfare and official protocol. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in civilian clothes, driving an ordinary car, and challenges you to look beyond appearances to recognize what really matters. The lesson they would spend their careers teaching was simple but profound. In security, as in life, nothing is ever quite as straightforward as it first appears. The key to success lies not in following rigid rules, but in maintaining the flexibility to adapt when reality doesn't match expectations. And sometimes the person you least expect to be in command turns out to be exactly the person who has been in command all along.